The gunshot echoed through the rugged valley, sending a flock of startled crows into the sky, as Thomas Black would know. Thomas Baxter stood rigid at the edge of the rocky outcrop, his weathered hand still clutching the smoking Colt revolver. Arizona Territory, 1881, and another piece of his past lay dead at his feet, eyes staring blankly at the endless blue above. 6 years, he whispered to the corpse. 6 years I've been running from what we did in Tucson. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Hualapai Mountains as Thomas knelt beside the body of his former partner. He hadn't wanted to kill him, but Winley had tracked him down, threatening to expose everything to the good people of Kingman. Thomas had made his choice. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and dust as Thomas began to dig. His shoulders, broad and strong from years of ranch work, strained against his faded blue shirt as he worked the rocky soil. This would be the 4th grave he'd dug in these hills, each one containing a piece of the violent past he desperately wanted to forget. Miles below in the valley, Madeline Crawford stood on the porch of her modest boarding house on the outskirts of Kingman, her hand shielding her eyes as she stared up at the distant mountains. She'd seen Thomas ride out early that morning, rifle strapped to his saddle, determination in his eyes. It was the 3rd time this month he'd disappeared into those hills, and each time he returned more withdrawn, the shadows beneath his eyes darker. "He'll be back," she murmured to herself, though uncertainty tinged her voice. Madeline had arrived in Kingman 8 months prior, fleeing a loveless engagement in St. Louis. She'd purchased the struggling boarding house with money saved from her teaching days and worked tirelessly to make it respectable. Thomas had been her first boarder, a quiet, hard-working cowboy who kept to himself but never failed to split firewood or repair what needed fixing around the place. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in hues of orange and purple, Thomas packed the dirt tight over Ellie's grave. No marker, no prayer, just another secret buried in the Hualapai Hills. He'd come to Kingman seeking anonymity, a place where no one knew of the Wells Fargo robbery that had gone terribly wrong, leaving 3 men dead and Thomas with blood on his hands that no amount of scrubbing could wash away. He hadn't counted on meeting someone like Madeline. The thought of her waiting at the boarding house sent a confusing mixture of warmth and dread through him. In the 8 months he'd known her, he'd found himself drawn to her quiet strength, her kind smile, the way she hummed old hymns while working in her garden. But getting close to anyone meant risking his secrets being discovered. And now, with Ellie's body freshly buried, the past felt dangerously close to the surface. Thomas mounted his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper, and began the treacherous descent down the mountain trail. Night was falling fast, and the temperature dropped quickly in the desert. As the lights of Kingman came into view, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the feeling of being caught between 2 worlds. Madeline had just finished serving dinner to her 5 boarders when she heard the distinctive sound of hoofbeats approaching. Relief washed over her as she stepped onto the porch, watching Thomas dismount and lead Copper toward the small stable behind the house. "You missed supper," she called, her voice carrying in the still night air, "but I saved you a plate." Thomas paused, his face half hidden in shadow. "You didn't have to do that, Miss Crawford." "It's Madeline," she corrected him gently, as she had dozens of times before, "and I wanted to." Their eyes met briefly before Thomas looked away, nodding as he continued toward the stable. Madeline watched him go, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the careful way he moved like a man carrying an invisible burden. She'd seen that look before, on her father's face after he'd returned from the war. Something had happened up in those mountains, something that had added another weight to Thomas's already heavy load. Inside the stable, Thomas unsaddled Copper and brushed him down methodically, finding comfort in the familiar routine. His mind replayed the confrontation with Ellie, the accusations, the threats. "I know what you did with that money, Baxter. The others might be dead, but I'm still here and I want my share." The memory made his hands shake. When he finally entered the boarding house, the main room was empty save for Madeline, who sat in a rocking chair by the fire mending a shirt. She looked up when he entered, her green eyes searching his face. "Your plate's in the warming oven," she said, setting aside her sewing. I'll fetch it for you. You don't need to serve me, Thomas said, but Madeline was already on her feet, moving toward the kitchen with purpose. Nonsense, you look half-starved and completely worn out. She returned with a plate heaped with beef stew and cornbread. Sit, eat. Thomas did as he was told, too exhausted to argue. The food was good, hearty, and flavorful, but he barely tasted it, his mind still up in the hills with the newly turned earth. You were gone a long while this time, Madeline remarked, resuming her mending. Her tone was casual, but Thomas could hear the question beneath it. Had some business to attend to, he replied, knowing how inadequate the explanation was. Madeline's fingers stilled on her sewing. In the mountains? Yes, alone. Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Yes, alone. Madeline held his gaze for a long moment before returning to her work. Mr. Jenkins from the Mercantile asked about you today, said the ranch up at Coyote Pass is still looking for a foreman. Good pay from what I hear. I'm fine where I am. Breaking horses for Mac Gregor only gives you work 3 days a week, Madeline pointed out, and you've been talking about moving on. The thought had crossed Thomas's mind more than once. Each time someone from his past found him, the urge to flee grew stronger. But something kept him in Kingman, tethered to this place to her. I'm not going anywhere just yet, he said, surprising himself with the admission. A small smile curved Madeline's lips, though she kept her eyes on her sewing. I'm glad to hear it. This place would feel different without you around. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the rhythmic creak of Madeline's rocking chair. It was moments like these that made Thomas forget, if only briefly, about the graves in the hills. That night, Thomas dreamed of Tucson, of the bank job gone wrong, of gunfire and shouting and the look of betrayal on young Billy's face when Thomas had refused to go back for him. He woke in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled around him, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he kept beneath his pillow. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the thin curtains of his room. Thomas sat up, running a hand through his dark hair, now streaked with premature gray at the temples. At 32, he felt decades older, worn down by the weight of his deeds. A soft knock at his door startled him. Thomas, Madeline's voice came through the wood, is everything all right? I heard. It sounded like you were in distress. Thomas swallowed hard, embarrassed that his nightmares had disturbed her. I'm fine, Miss Madeline, just a bad dream. There was a pause. Would you like some coffee? I've just put the pot on. The simple offer of coffee, the normalcy of it, made something in Thomas's chest ache. I'll be down shortly, he managed to say. When he descended the stairs 15 minutes later, freshly shaved and dressed, the aroma of coffee and frying bacon filled the boarding house. The other boarders, 2 miners, a clerk from the railroad office, and an elderly widow were already seated at the large dining table. Thomas nodded greetings as he took his usual place at the end. Madeline emerged from the kitchen carrying a platter of eggs and bacon, her auburn hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, a few tendrils escaping to frame her face. At 28, she had the confident bearing of a woman who had faced hardship and emerged stronger for it. You're looking more rested this morning, Mr. Baxter, Mrs. Henderson, the widow, observed as Madeline placed the platter on the table. Fresh mountain air does a body good, Thomas replied, reaching for the coffee pot. HMPH, the old woman sniffed. Seems to me you spend an awful lot of time in those hills for a man who breaks horses for a living. Thomas tensed, but before he could respond, Madeline smoothly intervened. Mrs. Henderson, I believe you mentioned wanting to visit your sister in Prescott next month. Have you made arrangements for the stage? As the conversation turned to travel plans, Thomas caught Madeline's eye and nodded his thanks. She gave a slight shrug in return, as if to say it was nothing, but they both knew it wasn't nothing. She was protecting him, though she couldn't possibly know from what. After breakfast, Thomas headed to Mac Gregor's ranch, where 3 wild Mustangs awaited his attention. The work was dangerous but straightforward, no deception, no moral gray areas, just man and beast, will against will. By midday, he had made progress with 2 of the horses, earning grudging respect from the ranch hands who watched him work. You've got away with them difficult ones, Mac Gregor commented, his Scottish brogue thick despite decades in America. Ever think about staying on permanent like? Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, considering the offer. Might do, he said noncommittally. MacGregor nodded, not pushing further. Well, the offer stands. Could use a man who doesn't spook easy. The irony of the statement wasn't lost on Thomas. If MacGregor only knew how much did spook him, how often he looked over his shoulder, how many sleepless nights he'd spent listening for approaching footsteps. As Thomas rode back to town that afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the mountains, promising a rare summer storm. The air felt heavy with anticipation, matching his mood. Something was shifting within him, a restlessness, but also a yearning to stop running. He was crossing the main street when Sheriff Davis stepped out of his office, raising a hand in greeting. Thomas's heart rate quickened, but he reined Copper to a stop. "Afternoon, Baxter," the sheriff said, squinting up at him. "Been meaning to have a word." "What about?" Davis glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Got a telegram from Tucson yesterday. Seems they're still looking for information about that Wells Fargo job from 75. Thomas kept his expression neutral, though his mouth had gone dry. "Before my time in Arizona," he said evenly. "Figured as much," Davis nodded. "But thought you should know there's word that one of the gang might be in these parts. Fellow named Lee Thornton. Mean anything to you?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "Can't say it does." "Well, keep an eye out. Man like that desperate on the run could be dangerous." "I'll do that," Thomas said, tipping his hat before nudging Copper forward, away from the sheriff's scrutinizing gaze. By the time he reached the boarding house, the first fat raindrops were falling, and thunder rumbled in the distance. He found Madeline in the garden, hastily covering her vegetable plants with burlap to protect them from the coming downpour. Without a word, Thomas dismounted and moved to help her, securing the coverings as the wind picked up. "Thank you," Madeline said as they finished, rain now falling steadily. She looked up at the sky, blinking as raindrops hit her face. "It's been so dry, the plants will be grateful." Thomas watched her, struck by the simple joy in her expression. "You're getting soaked," he pointed out, his voice gruff with an emotion he couldn't name. Madeline laughed, a clear, bright sound that seemed to cut through the gathering storm. "So are you," she countered. They stood there for a moment, rain plastering their clothes to their bodies, neither making a move toward shelter. Thomas felt something shift between them, a barrier lowering, if only slightly. "We should go inside," he finally said, though he made no move to do so. Madeline nodded, but she too remained rooted to the spot. "Thomas," she began, then hesitated. "I don't mean to pry, but then don't," he interrupted, more harshly than he'd intended. Hurt flashed in her eyes, and she took a step back. "Of course I apologize." As she turned to go, Thomas reached out, catching her wrist. "Wait," he said, his voice softening. "I'm sorry, it's just... there are things about me you're better off not knowing." Madeline looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up to his face. Rain trickled down her cheeks like tears. "I think I should be the judge of that." Before Thomas could respond, a crash of thunder directly overhead made them both jump. The moment broken, they hurried toward the house, reaching the porch just as the rain turned into a downpour. "You should change into something dry," Thomas said, suddenly aware of how inappropriate it was to be standing there with her, both of them soaking wet, her cotton dress clinging to her form. Madeline seemed to realize it too, crossing her arms over her chest. "Yes, I should start dinner soon anyway." She hesitated, then added, "But Thomas, if you ever do want to talk." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As she disappeared into the house, Thomas remained on the porch, watching the rain wash over Kingman, wondering how long it would be before his past caught up with him again and what it would cost him when it did. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the desert air scrubbed clean by the storm. Thomas rose early, his decision made. He would ride into the hills one last time to make sure Ellie's grave was secure after the rain. Then he would return and tell Madeline. What? That he cared for her, that he wanted to stay but feared what his presence in her life might bring. He left before breakfast, a hastily scrawled note explaining that he'd be back by sundown. The trail was muddy and treacherous after the rain, but Copper was sure-footed, picking his way carefully up the slopes. When Thomas reached the site of Ellie's grave, he dismounted and approached cautiously. The freshly turned earth had held, though the rain had packed it down, making it look older than it was. Relief washed over him, followed quickly by a renewed sense of guilt. 4 men dead because of the choices he'd made 6 years ago. 4 souls weighing on his conscience. Thomas knelt beside the grave, removing his hat. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, though whether he was addressing Ellie or all his ghosts, he couldn't say. He stayed there longer than he'd intended, lost in memories and regrets, until the position of the sun warned him that afternoon was waning. As he remounted Copper, Thomas came to a decision. He would tell Madeline the truth, not every detail, perhaps, but enough that she would understand who he was and what he had done. She deserved that much, and if she turned away from him afterwards, so be it. Meanwhile, in Kingman, Madeline was dealing with an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Davis stood in her kitchen, hat in hand, an apologetic expression on his weathered face. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Crawford, but I need to ask about Thomas Baxter." Madeline's hands stilled on the dough she was kneading. "What about him? When did he ride out this morning?" "Before dawn," she answered carefully. "He left a note saying he'd be back by sundown." "Why? Has something happened?" Davis sighed heavily. "I received another telegram from Tucson this morning. There's a substantial reward for information leading to the capture of the remaining members of the Wells Fargo gang. One of them matches Baxter's description." Madeline felt a chill run through her, despite the warmth of the kitchen. "That's ridiculous. Thomas is a horsebreaker, not a criminal." "How long have you known him, Miss Crawford?" 8 months, she admitted. "But I'm a good judge of character, Sheriff. Thomas is a good man." Davis looked unconvinced. "Good men can do bad things, especially when they're young and foolish. The robbery was 6 years ago. 6 years." The time frame echoed in Madeline's mind, connecting with something Thomas had once mentioned in passing, that he'd been in Arizona territory for 6 years, that he'd come to start fresh. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "My job," Davis replied simply. "I've sent Deputy Roberts to follow his trail. If Baxter is innocent, he has nothing to worry about." But Madeline wasn't so sure. She'd seen the haunted look in Thomas's eyes, the way he startled at sudden noises, how he always positioned himself facing doors and windows. Whatever his past held, it wasn't peaceful. After the sheriff left, Madeline abandoned her baking and hurried upstairs to Thomas's room. She hesitated at the door, knowing she was crossing a line, but concern for him outweighed her sense of propriety. The room was spartanly furnished: a bed, a chair, a small table with a basin and pitcher. Thomas's few possessions were neatly arranged, nothing out of place. Madeline wasn't sure what she was looking for until she spotted the edge of a wooden box protruding from beneath the bed. Kneeling, she pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. The top one, from a Tucson paper, headlined "Wells Fargo Robbery Leaves 3 Dead." Madeline's hands trembled as she read the account of how 4 men had held up a stage carrying bank money, resulting in the deaths of 2 guards and a passenger. Beneath the clippings was a daguerreotype of 5 young men, arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling broadly. She recognized Thomas immediately, though his face was fuller, his eyes less guarded. On the back, someone had written, "Thomas, Illy, Billy, Jackson, and me, Tucson, 1874. Madeline sat back on her heels, the evidence of Thomas's past spread before her. Her first instinct was denial. Surely there was some explanation, some reason why Thomas would keep these mementos, if not out of remorse. But doubt crept in, cold and insidious. Had she been harboring a killer all these months? The sound of approaching hoofbeats jolted her from her thoughts. Hastily, she returned everything to the box and slid it back under the bed. When she reached the porch, Deputy Roberts was dismounting, his expression grim. "Is the sheriff here?" he asked without preamble. "No, he left about an hour ago," Madeline replied, her heart pounding. "Did you find Thomas?" Roberts shook his head. "Lost his trail in the hills. Rain washed most of it away." He squinted up at the mountains. "Strange place for a horsebreaker to spend so much time." "He enjoys the solitude," Madeline said defensively. "Maybe," Roberts conceded, though his tone suggested doubt. "Or maybe he's got something hidden up there." After the deputy left, Madeline paced the porch, anxiety gnawing at her. The sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting the desert in gold. Thomas had promised to be back by sundown, but what if he'd seen the deputy following him? What if he never came back? The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest. Despite the revelations of the day, despite the evidence suggesting Thomas had been involved in something terrible, she couldn't bear the idea of him disappearing from her life. As the last rays of sun gilded the mountains, Madeline made her decision. Saddling her mare, a gentle sorrel named Penny, she set off toward the hills. If Thomas wouldn't come to her, she would go to him. The trail was still muddy in places, slowing her progress. Darkness fell quickly, but the full moon provided enough light to continue, though Madeline's nerves frayed with each passing minute. She had never ventured this far into the Hualapai alone, and the night sounds the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of creatures in the brush set her on edge. She had nearly convinced herself to turn back when she spotted the glow of a campfire ahead, tucked into a small clearing among the rocks. Approaching cautiously, she made out the silhouette of a man sitting beside it, head bowed. "Thomas," she called, her voice carrying in the still night air. His head snapped up, hand immediately going to his hip where his revolver rested. When he recognized her, his expression shifted from alertness to disbelief. "Madeline, what in God's name are you doing up here alone at night?" She dismounted, leading Penny toward the fire. "Looking for you." Thomas stood, his face half in shadow. "It's dangerous. You shouldn't have come." "Neither should you have if what the sheriff suspects is true," Madeline countered, watching him carefully. Thomas went very still. "What does he suspect?" "That you were part of the Wells Fargo robbery in Tucson." "That you're wanted for murder." Madeline took a deep breath. "I found the box under your bed, Thomas. I saw the newspaper clippings, the photograph." For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at her across the flickering firelight. Then slowly he sank back down onto the log he'd been using as a seat. "You should go back to town," he said, his voice hollow, not without answers. Madeline tethered Penny to a nearby tree and moved closer to the fire. "Tell me the truth, Thomas, all of it." He looked up at her, his blue eyes reflecting the flames. "If I do, there's no going back. You'll be complicit." "I already am," she said simply. "I chose to come here instead of telling the sheriff where you might be." Thomas ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. "Sit down," he finally said. "It's a long story." As Madeline settled across from him, Thomas began to speak, his voice low and measured. He told her of growing up poor in Missouri, of drifting west after the war, of meeting Illy and the others in a Tucson saloon. How what was supposed to be a simple robbery had turned deadly when one of the guards reached for his gun. "I didn't fire the shots that killed them," he said, staring into the fire, "but I was there, I helped plan it. That makes me just as guilty." "And the money?" Madeline asked. "We split it 4 ways after Billy was killed during the escape. I took my share and ran north while the others scattered." Thomas looked up at her. "I didn't spend it, couldn't bring myself to. It's still hidden, all but what I needed to buy copper. The others, dead now, all of them." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Illy was the last. He found me here in Kingman, threatened to expose me if I didn't give him more money. We argued and—" "You killed him," Madeline finished quietly. Thomas nodded once sharply. 4 days ago, up in these hills. I buried him, just like I buried the others when they found me." The implications of what he was saying sank in slowly. "The others are here too, in these mountains?" "Jackson 2 years ago in Colorado, but yes, Billy and now Illy, they're here." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air swept through Madeline. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to reconcile the man before her, the man who had fixed her porch steps, who left wildflowers on her windowsill, who spoke gently to frightened horses with the outlaw he described. "Why did you stay in Kingman?" she asked. "After you killed Billy, why not keep moving?" Thomas looked at her directly then, a vulnerability in his expression she'd never seen before. "You know why." The simple admission hung between them, weighted with everything unsaid. "What will you do now?" Madeline asked after a long silence. "Keep running," Thomas answered with a resignation that broke her heart. "The sheriff knows enough to be suspicious. It won't be long before he connects me to Illy's disappearance." "You could turn yourself in," Madeline suggested, though she knew even as she said it that it wasn't a real option. Thomas gave a bitter laugh. "And hang, no, I've made my peace with running. He hesitated. "I just wish I'd told you how I felt before it came to this." Madeline rose from her seat and moved around the fire to sit beside him. Tentatively, she reached for his hand, half expecting him to pull away. He didn't. "I think I've known how you felt for some time," she said softly, "just as I think you've known how I feel." Thomas turned to look at her, hope and fear warring in his expression. "Madeline, I'm a wanted man. I've killed people. You should be running from me, not toward me." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but I've never been one to do what I should." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Thomas was on his feet instantly, gun drawn, pulling Madeline behind him protectively. "It's the sheriff," he said grimly. "They must have followed your trail." Panic flared in Madeline's chest. "What do we do?" Thomas holstered his gun and gripped her shoulders. "Listen to me. When they get here, you tell them I forced you to come with me, that you were afraid. Do you understand?" "No," Madeline said firmly, covering his hands with her own. "I won't lie for you, Thomas, not like that." "Damn it, woman, this isn't the time for stubbornness. They'll think you're my accomplice." "Then let them," Madeline declared, a plan forming in her mind. "Thomas, where exactly is the Wells Fargo money hidden?" He blinked, thrown by the question. "In a cave about half a mile from here." "Why?" "Because," Madeline said, determination hardening her voice, "you're going to turn it in, all of it, and throw yourself on the mercy of the court." Thomas shook his head incredulously. "It won't make a difference. 3 men are dead." "It might," Madeline insisted. "Especially if you testify against the others, tell the authorities everything you know about the gang." "The others are all dead." "The sheriff doesn't know that," Madeline pointed out, "and your information could still be valuable. Thomas, it's your only chance." The sound of horses was closer now, accompanied by men's voices calling to each other. They had perhaps 2 minutes before they were discovered. Thomas looked from Madeline to the direction of the approaching search party, his expression torn. Then, with a muttered curse, he strode to his horse and pulled something from his saddlebag, a small leather pouch. Returning to Madeline, he pressed it into her hands. "What's this?" she asked, feeling the weight of several small, hard objects. "Gold nuggets," Thomas explained quickly. "I found them panning in a creek up here last month. They're clean, not from the robbery. If things go badly for me, use them. Start fresh somewhere else." Madeline's throat tightened. "I'm not leaving you." "You might have to," he said grimly, just as the first rider appeared at the edge of the clearing, lantern held high. "Baxter, Miss Crawford," Sheriff Davis called, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God you're both all right." 3 more riders emerged from the darkness, Deputy Roberts and 2 men Madeline didn't recognize, likely townspeople who had joined the search party. All had weapons drawn. Thomas stepped forward, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "Sheriff," he acknowledged, "I believe we need to talk." Davis dismounted, approaching cautiously. "That we do, son. Starting with why Miss Crawford is up here with you in the middle of the night." "I came of my own accord," Madeline said firmly, moving to stand beside Thomas. "To warn him that you were asking questions about Tucson." The sheriff's gaze shifted between them, assessing. "And did he tell you the truth about what happened there?" "He did," Madeline confirmed. "All of it, and he's prepared to do the right thing now." Thomas glanced at her, a mixture of fear and resolve in his eyes before turning back to Davis. "I know where the money is," he said. "All of my share untouched, and I'm willing to tell you everything about the robbery, about the gang." A flicker of surprise crossed the sheriff's weathered face. "That's a start, Baxter, but it doesn't change what happened to those Wells Fargo men." "No," Thomas agreed, his voice heavy with regret. "It doesn't, but maybe it counts for something that I never spent the money, that I've been trying to put it behind me." "By burying your former partners in these hills?" Davis asked shrewdly. Thomas flinched but didn't deny it. "They came after me. I defended myself." "We'll let a judge sort that out," the sheriff said, though his tone had softened slightly. "For now, you're coming back to town with us." As Davis approached with handcuffs, Madeline impulsively stepped between them. "Wait. Before you take him, give us a moment, please." To her surprise, the sheriff hesitated, then nodded. 1 minute, he agreed, stepping back to give them a semblance of privacy. Madeline turned to Thomas, taking his hands in hers. "This isn't the end," she whispered fiercely. "I'll find a lawyer." "We'll fight this." Thomas shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "Don't waste your life waiting for me, Madeline. I'm not worth it." "That's for me to decide," she countered. Then, heedless of their audience, She rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that conveyed everything she couldn't say aloud. Thomas responded with desperate intensity, his arms encircling her waist, pulling her close as if he could imprint the feel of her on his memory. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, the sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly. "Time to go, Baxter," Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving Madeline's face. "I'll come for you," she promised, "however long it takes." "I'll be waiting," he replied softly as the sheriff secured the handcuffs around his wrists. As the search party prepared to return to town, Thomas paused, looking back at the mountains where he had buried both his past and his former companions. In the moonlight, they loomed dark and mysterious, keeping their secrets close. Madeline, watching him, understood then what he had been doing all those times he'd ridden into the hills. Not just hiding evidence, but seeking absolution, trying to put to rest the ghosts that haunted him. Perhaps now, with the truth exposed and the stolen money about to be returned, those ghosts might finally find peace. The journey back to Kingman was silent, each rider lost in their own thoughts. Dawn was breaking as they reached the town, the first rays of sun gilding the desert landscape. Madeline rode beside Thomas, their knees occasionally brushing, a silent reminder of her presence. When they reached the jail, a small crowd had already gathered, word having spread rapidly through the small community. Madeline dismounted quickly, moving to Thomas's side as the sheriff helped him down from his horse, the handcuffs making the process awkward. "I'll come see you," she promised as Davis led him toward the jailhouse door. Thomas paused, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll be here," he said simply. In the weeks that followed, Madeline became a familiar sight at the jail, bringing meals, books, and news from the outside world. She hired a lawyer from Prescott, using some of the gold nuggets Thomas had given her, and wrote countless letters to the territorial governor pleading Thomas's case. The recovery of the Wells Fargo money, nearly $6,000, buried in a small cave in the Hualapai Mountains, created a stir that reached all the way to Tucson. When Thomas provided detailed information about the robbery and the fate of the other gang members, authorities were able to close several unsolved cases. 3 months after his arrest, Thomas stood before a judge in Prescott. Madeline sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the sentence was pronounced. 5 years in Yuma Territorial Prison, reduced from hanging due to his cooperation and the return of the stolen funds. "It could have been worse," Thomas told her later in the small meeting room adjacent to the courthouse. "Much worse." Madeline reached across the table, taking his hands. "5 years," she whispered. "It's a lifetime." "Not quite," he said, a hint of his old smile returning. "And when it's over, I'll be free, truly free for the first time in 6 years. "I'll wait for you," Madeline declared, her green eyes bright with determination. "I'll be there when you walk out." Thomas searched her face. "You shouldn't have to put your life on hold for me." "I'm not putting anything on hold," she countered. "I'll keep running the boarding house, I'll live my life, but my heart is yours, Thomas Baxter. That won't change in 5 years or 50. 2 days later, she stood at the station as Thomas boarded the prison wagon bound for Yuma, along with 3 other prisoners. Their goodbye was brief, observed by armed guards, but the promise in their eyes spoke volumes. "I love you," Thomas said simply, the first time he had voiced the words aloud. "And I love you," Madeline replied, pressing a small Bible into his hands. "Come back to me." As the wagon pulled away, dust rising in its wake, Madeline remained at the station long after it had disappeared from view. The mountains loomed in the distance, their secrets now exposed but somehow less threatening in the light of day. 5 years later, on a sweltering August morning, Madeline Crawford stood outside the gates of Yuma Territorial Prison, her heart pounding as she watched prisoners being processed for release. She had traveled 2 days by stage to be there, leaving her now thriving boarding house in the care of Mrs. Henderson. When Thomas finally emerged, squinting in the bright sunlight, he looked both familiar and strange. His face was leaner, new lines etched around his eyes and mouth, his dark hair now liberally streaked with gray. But when he saw her waiting, the smile that transformed his features was purely Thomas. They met in the middle of the dusty yard, neither caring about the curious onlookers as they embraced. Thomas buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her as if it were the sweetest air after years of confinement. "You came," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I promised I would," Madeline replied simply. That evening, in a small church in Yuma, they were married by a priest who asked no questions about their past. Thomas wore a new suit purchased with money Madeline had saved, and she wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. Their only witnesses were the priest's housekeeper and a young cowboy passing through town. As they exchanged vows, Thomas held Madeline's gaze steadily, his voice clear and sure as he promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life. The shadows that had once haunted his eyes were fainter now, tempered by years of reflection and the knowledge that she had waited for him, believing in his worth when he himself had not. "Where will we go?" Madeline asked later as they lay in the narrow bed of their hotel room, her head resting on his chest. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I was thinking north," he finally said. "Maybe Montana territory. Open country, plenty of work for a man who knows horses." "A fresh start," Madeline nodded, pleased with the idea. "One more stop first," Thomas added. "Kingman, to collect your things and to say a proper goodbye to the past." A week later, they stood together on the ridge of the Hualapai Mountains, looking down at the town of Kingman spread out below. The graves Thomas had dug were now unmarked and indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape, nature having reclaimed them during his absence. "I dreamed of this place," he confessed, his arm around Madeline's waist. "In prison, not of the graves or what I did, but of you, waiting at the bottom of the hill for me to come back down." Madeline leaned into him, her hand covering his where it rested on her hip. "And here I am." "Here you are," Thomas echoed, wonder still evident in his voice. "My salvation." "No," she corrected gently. "You saved yourself when you chose to face the consequences of your past. I just believed in you." Thomas turned to her then, framing her face with his hands. "That belief kept me alive in Yuma," he said seriously. "Knowing you were out here, waiting, loving me despite everything." "Because of everything," Madeline corrected. "Your past is part of who you are, Thomas. All of it, the mistakes, the regrets, the amends you've made. I love the whole man." As the sun began to set, painting the desert in gold and crimson, they made their way down the trail toward Kingman one last time. Tomorrow they would board the stage heading north toward their new life together. But tonight they would sleep in the boarding house where they had first fallen in love, coming full circle before moving forward. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Madeline nestled against Thomas's side. She felt a peace she had never known before. The cowboy had buried his past in the hills, and she had waited at the bottom until he came back down. Now together they would build a future unshackled by secrets and regret. "I love you, Thomas Baxter," she whispered against his skin. "And I love you, Madeline Baxter," he replied, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. "Until my last breath and beyond." Outside their window, the desert night was alive with stars, bearing witness to the promise between them, a promise of forgiveness, of redemption, and of love that had survived against all odds in the unforgiving landscape of the American West.